Hello, this is Professor Kent Lee. Welcome back to my advanced writing class, or advanced composition, whatever it's called officially. In this lecture, I'm going to come back to the topic of arguments and argumentation. And this is from the chapter in the book on argumentation and logical fallacies, argumentation and fallacies. In the first section of this chapter, I'm just going to go through some of the examples here in the book of different kinds of arguments and counter-arguments. So let's look at some basic rhetorical or persuasive strategies for making an argument, making a case, say in a college paper. You're probably familiar with these basic reasons. Inductive reasoning, that's kind of starting from particular instances or examples and leading into a generalization or a conclusion from specific facts to a generalization or to a conclusion. Assuming, of course, that these facts are maybe representative examples, they're good examples, representative, they're not outliers or extreme cases that work for your case. And it assumes that the evidence is reliable and sufficient. So here's an example in my book. Several U.S. states have legalized marijuana and have taxed the sales of marijuana products and have earned a lot of extra revenue, government money, which has been great for state and local governments, provided them more money for, spending on education and health services and infrastructure like building new roads. Thus, marijuana should be legalized in the entire country. In case you haven't been following the news the past 10 years, legalizing marijuana has been a trend in Western European countries and Canada and various states in the US. And even now, conservative politicians are on board with this, legalizing marijuana. So this is potentially a good argument. You would need to develop it more. It leads from specific instances like these states, and they've legalized it maybe somewhat different ways and taken different paths and different approaches. But maybe if you look at enough states that are a representative sample, like different kinds of states and different ways that they've done it, if you did that, this could then lead to an argument that, okay, it should be legalized in the entire country, that the US government should just legalize it as well. That would be a legitimate inductive argument from specific cases, specific states, and different legalization schemes to a general conclusion or a general argument about nationwide legalization. Here's another example. Deductive reasoning, that's when you start with a general principle and you either state or argue for a general principle, and from that you then lead to your main argument. So here we have an example where the writer is dealing with austerity measures. Austerity means when a government is facing difficulties like economic problems and the government cuts spending back, especially spending on social programs or healthcare or education. And so this paragraph begins by talking about how governments often implement austerity measures, like in bad times, but they've never worked and in fact have been harmful. They can actually weaken an already weak economy or prolong a recession. And that's something that maybe the writer would need to show in a body paragraph. Thus, the writer then gets to the main thesis. Since austerity programs actually are worse, therefore, the United Kingdom needs to increase spending in its upcoming budget year. It should increase spending on healthcare, education, and social programs because that would be better for the economy and better for the country. So that's going from a general principle, austerity spending is harmful, to the conclusion, the UK needs to increase its spending on these programs. And as long as these are developed appropriately in the body of the paper, these would be good arguments. Now, another kind of approach I have here in the book are things like ethical moral appeals or pathos. Pathos literally means kind of emotion, but not like an emotional appeal, emotionalistic, but appealing to people's values and their emotional sensibilities, their moral sensibilities. So appealing to moral principles, kind of ethos, moral principles, or values and sensibilities, which is more like pathos. That also kind of, without actually making directly emotionalistic or unprofessional arguments or irrational arguments, you're appealing to their sensibilities, their moral sensibilities. So it shouldn't be too emotional or subjective. And that's when you present, for example, arguments or examples where, for example, this is really harmful, this is hurting people, people are suffering. The right thing to do, the right response is to do this. So ethical appeals, moral appeals, those often go along with some of these other approaches like inductive and deductive approaches. Let's look at some examples in the next section of my book on logical arguments, section 2, where we have some kind of more logic or rule-based approaches, and some of these are better than others. So the first example, 2.1.1, a deductive argument, this deals with Trump. And so these are examples from a few years ago, and has been serious debate ever since Trump first started running for president in 2016, whether Trump is a fascist. And he clearly exhibited some tendencies that were concerning back in 2016. And so various professional magazines in political science, politics, economics, news, magazines, analysts started debating whether Trump is a fascist, whether we should be concerned about fascist tendencies. And this is a legitimate argument. There have been good points made on both sides by people who say he is and some people who say he should not be considered a fascist. So here's one example, a more deductive example. Number 1, Trump, fascists engage in blaming other races and minorities for a country's problems. They call for excluding or removing other races, and Donald Trump has done this regarding Mexicans and Muslims and other groups. Therefore, Trump is a fascist. Is that a justified conclusion? In this case, no. It begins with a simplistic definition or description of fascist. I mean, that's one thing that they do, blaming other races and calling for their removal or exclusion, yeah. But there's a lot more to it than that. That's kind of a simplistic description of fascism. And therefore, the premises are not really properly developed, so the conclusion is really weak. It's not really justified here. You have to consider all the things that define what a fascist is, not just this one point. To say, therefore, Trump is a fascist based on these arguments, it doesn't work. And the next one might be slightly better. This is more of an inductive argument. Trump has done this, advocating deporting aliens, building a wall between U.S. and Mexico, saying Muslims should not be allowed into the U.S., racist comments against Muslims, Arabs, Mexicans, sexist comments towards women. His behavior and attitudes are consistent with policies of previous fascists in history who have done similar things. And nationalistic talk and policies and putting down other people. Therefore, Trump is probably a fascist. This is better. It might not consider all the important definitions of a fascist, so that's a possible weakness, but it makes a more cautious conclusion. He's probably a fascist because he ticks some of the boxes. He checks some of the boxes, this, and this. Now, it doesn't really consider maybe a full definition of fascism, and that's a possible problem here. So this is better than the previous one. It's not fully convincing for that problem, but it's better and it's more cautious in its conclusion. He's probably a fascist, or maybe if you said he has fascist tendencies. Next, we have what's called kind of a best option or inferencing based argument. So induction and deduction aren't the only options. A common option, especially in social sciences, or if you're dealing with political issues or complex issues, is to look at different aspects, different sides, different possibilities, and evaluate them, and then say, this is the best one. This is the best explanation. So that's kind of an optimization or best option or inferencing based argument. You infer what's the best one out of the 2 or 3 or 5 different possibilities. So it starts like this. His behavior and attitudes are consistent with policies of previous fascists who did this and this and this. His statements are consistent his attitudes and statements concerning minorities and such. However, he does not call for violent action from supporters or overthrowing the current government, although the events of January 6th actually do present a problem here now. He doesn't advocate outright violence against other groups like real fascists like Franco and Mussolini and Hitler did. So he doesn't check all of the boxes. And it goes on to say fascists use outright terror and fear tactics, and Trump has not done these, although again, January 6th, the attack on the Capitol kind of checks this box now. He appeals to nationalistic and xenophobic feelings, that is, being afraid or hateful towards outsiders, different people, and foreigners, and appealing to frustrations of the lower class. The way he has denounced his opponents, the language he uses, kind of consistent with fascism, insulting women, kind of, but not quite consistent with fascism. Trump has not tried to organize paramilitary groups like fascists normally would. However, again, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th kind of checks that box, maybe. Personality, cult-based politics, kind of, yeah, he's into that. Now, narcissism. So Trump is more of a personal narcissist rather than a true fascist like, Mussolini, Hitler, or Franco. Psychologists believe he has a narcissistic personality or something similar. But his rhetoric is more like political opportunism, nationalism, authoritarianism, which doesn't necessarily equal fascism. And to invoke fascism, to say he's a fascist, that kind of demeans the horrors of horrible things done by real fascists in history like Hitler and Mussolini. Therefore, the conclusion is the best option is something kind of in between. He's not really a fascist. He's dangerous as an authoritarian, as an extremist, and as a narcissist who can nonetheless damage democracy if he continues to stay in power, or now if he comes back to power. And you can find ways of countering these different claims, as we'll see a little bit later. There are some other examples I'll present in a minute which might counter this kind of claim. He's not really a fascist. He's dangerous, but not quite a fascist. Well, let's look at some other examples. Here we have some case-based arguments in the next section, version A. What have you got here? Trump has joked about violence towards minorities and opponents, but he hasn't actually directly advocated violence against them. He hasn't used the government to engage in violence against his opponents, hasn't thrown them in jail. He's used the government to some degree against minorities. He hasn't been able to use the government to suppress his opponents like real fascists would. He hasn't formed non-government or paramilitary groups to commit violence against opponents like Hitler did, for example. He hasn't, at least not yet, attempted to give himself dictatorial powers, although, again, what he tried to do in January before he left seems like he was trying to, maybe. Conclusion, therefore, his situation is not analogous or not the same as actual past fascists, so we can't conclude he's a fascist. And again, you can offer arguments against this. You could say, well, what about what he did on January 6th, in January before he left? And as we know more and more, as that's being investigated, there are more and more signs that he was trying to kind of take over and overturn the election. So maybe you can argue against that. You can argue against some of his policies, some of his specific policies, and say, oh, that's kind of fascist-like. Some of his language, his rhetoric. Version B, here's another version, kind of looking at cases and examples. Trump, true, has not engaged in violence against minority groups, but he has targeted immigrants for unlawful imprisonment and deportation, human rights abuses. Okay, so here's kind of a concessive, that is conceding partly something. Although he has not engaged in direct violence against minority groups. So it's conceding, yeah, he didn't actually engage in direct violence against minority groups, but he did some awful illegal things to minorities, like Hispanic, Mexican immigrants, trying to get into the U.S., human rights abuses. So while that may be true, this is an argument here. Someone might say, well, he didn't do that. Okay, yeah, true, he didn't do that, but he did this. So it's kind of like, yes, but a concessive argument. I concede that. I'm conceding that point, but consider this argument. That's true, but he did this. He attempted to limit the right of asylum seekers. Okay, he made a number of racist remarks and had racist policies. He supposedly made some kind of very weak public statements against racism, yet so much of his behavior and his talk, his statements and policies were racist. So while he has not directly engaged in violence or used violence, he shares some important characteristics with past fascists. Therefore, he thus exhibits fascist tendencies. And that's kind of a qualified statement. So it considers arguments for and against and reaches a conclusion that is kind of balanced and in the middle. Not saying he's a fascist, but he shows some fascist tendencies. Okay, and so these are carefully constructed arguments, considering cases and examples. So these are kind of variations on inductive arguments that might work more effectively. Next one, kind of more policy or principle-based arguments, looking at policies, and we had to distinguish the person from the system, the leader versus the government. So the U.S. has not become a fascist state under Trump or used violence directly, but Trump shows tendencies in that direction. Appeals to nationalism, xenophobia, trying to seize power, concern with power and authority, which is consistent with social science research showing that an appeal to authoritarian power appeals to certain people who are open to that kind of government. People willing to use government to impose their views on others, and the idea you should just, if the government is doing what we think is right, then you all need to obey. Kind of authoritarian personality that's consistent with an authoritarian view of government. And again, his treatment of minorities, human rights violations show fascist tendencies. His own desire for power is a sign of narcissism, not necessarily fascism, but if you look at past dictators like Hitler and Mussolini, well, they show fascist, not only fascist, but narcissistic tendencies in their personal lives and their personal behavior. Hitler, for example, was very clearly a narcissist in his behavior, or something similar. He showed very strong narcissistic tendencies. Therefore, there is a connection between narcissism and fascist tendencies in a leader. So, with Trump, conclusion, we are seeing clear fascist tendencies and a growing danger of a greater degree of fascism the longer he stays in power, or if he comes back into power because he wants to run again for president in 2024. So those are carefully constructed arguments, and it considers an important psychological component, the narcissism that drives probably a lot of fascist leaders and dictators. Okay, so you can make arguments and counter-arguments on these kinds of points. So let's look at counter-arguments. So I'm going to shift gears and we're going to talk about marijuana legalization again.